Welcome to Creating Trauma-Informed School Policies, a practice forum for school and mental health leadership. As you are signing in, of course, please, we welcome you to put your name, where you're calling in from, and your role. And I'm also going to ask for everyone to mute themselves if you are not muted, so that we can really concentrate on the learning. My colleagues Rochelle and Kristen will all mute when we are not speaking, so that we can really support everyone's audio learning. If you have any tech issues, please put questions in the chat box. You can also directly chat to Joanne Oshel. So welcome again. We are creating trauma-informed school policies. It is an ongoing process, particularly because the world of learning of what trauma-informed is an ongoing, incredible discovery process. We just continue to get new science and new learning and new meaning making of even what this movement means. And so today we're going to be in conversation around what this can look like for those of us who are leaders in school environments, mental health environments, or both, or support school mental health leadership. I'm going to do a brief introduction. We are funded through SAMHSA, and we just wanted to make sure that while we are supported by SAMHSA, these words are our own. And who we are the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, MHTTC, and we serve the Pacific Islands. We serve California, Nevada, Hawaii, and Arizona. We are completely new. We just got funded as of September, November. So if you haven't heard of us, this is the first time. This is actually our first live webinar, and we're a new resource to you. If you are not calling from this region, that's totally okay as well, because we all work in partnership with the other mental health technology transfer centers across the country. So I want to just talk a little bit about what an MHTTC is. We offer technical assistance and training, resources, and referrals that really are aimed to support the mental health workforce. And this year we were specifically given funding to support the school mental health workforce, which is where this webinar and where this learning is coming from. So I'm going to move ahead, and I just wanted to offer that while you'll have more chance to hear about us at the end, we do offer webinars like you're on right now, newsletters. If you don't get our newsletter, we offer it every month with a lot of conferences and resources and guides like the one that this is based on. We support community of learning, online courses, and of course what makes us most happy are trainings and coaching and presentations. So if you're interested in any of TA, please let us know at the end. I also just wanted to note that because we only have an hour together, most likely there are going to be a lot of folks who are like, man, I wish that we had more time to talk about this, or wow, I heard that sentence, but I'm really curious about what this means to me. And so I just want to encourage you that most likely there are going to be more questions in the end than potentially answers. That's part of what this forum is for, is to raise questions of inquiry that really sharpen and support our practice. And so if you do have a desire to continue the learning, we are here for it, and we'll offer how to do that at the end. Who are we as we move forward with the team? So I just want to introduce myself. If you don't know my voice, my name is Leora Wolf-Kursan, and I work for the Center for Applied Research Solutions, and we are the organization who is supporting the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I get the honor of being the school mental health lead. And so we also have a couple other staff members, my colleague Rochelle Espiritu, who is also helping and supporting this webinar, and we have a really robust staff. This is me, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you and to see a lot of wonderful colleagues on the line. I want to pass it to my colleague Rochelle, who will be introducing herself, and then she'll pass it to Kristen. Rochelle, take it away.
Thanks, Leora, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rochelle Espiritu, and I'm really pleased to be on this webinar with you today. I'm a founding partner of Change Matrix, which is a minority and women-owned small business, and I also currently serve as the co-director of SAMHSA's Pacific Southwest MHTTC. I've been providing training and technical assistance and capacity building at the local, territory, tribal, state, and national level in multiple systems, including education and mental health, for many years. The reason I'm here today, though, is to share my experiences as a former school board member for Denver Public Schools. It's an experience that I often talk about as sitting on the inner edge of a large urban district. It was one of the most rewarding and most challenging leadership positions I've ever held. And this opportunity to bridge my professional experience with service leadership in my community was incredible. So while I served in this role, I provided direction and leadership for our whole child efforts and successfully passed a resolution for Denver to become a trauma-informed school district. And I'll be sharing a little bit more with you about those experiences throughout the presentation that Leora leads us through. And so I am now going to pass it off to Kristen.
Thanks, Rochelle. Good afternoon, all. I am Director for Policy Development at Child Trends. We are a research institute devoted exclusively to children, youth, and families, and my role is to help policymakers to utilize our research to drive decision-making and promote better outcomes for youth. My personal specialties include racial and ethnic disparities in education, in special education, creating supportive school climates, and promoting positive school discipline. And before Child Trends, I spent 7 years in the U.S. Department of Education, including the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education and the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. I'm excited to join this webinar so that I can share with you a new trauma-informed policy framework that Child Trends released to help policymakers advance state policies to create supportive learning environments for children with a history of traumatic experiences. And the policy framework we released is grounded in the assumption that to support children with trauma, we need a whole school, whole child approach. By whole school, I mean that we're not trying to identify or isolate children with adverse childhood experiences. Instead, we're trying to rethink school environments, including services, culture, norms, instructional practice, and interpersonal relationships, and recreate them so that they are safe and supportive for every child with the particular needs of traumatized children in mind. And by whole child, I mean that we are looking for ways to build school capacity to address the academic needs, social and emotional skills, and physical and mental health of students. So the framework, the trauma-informed policy framework that we released, provides that background and then proceeds to lay out a 3-part process to help states to shift policy. In part 1, states would build a statewide initiative for increasing awareness of trauma and its implications for teaching and learning across the entire state. And that means looking at the knowledge of state officials, increasing the knowledge of state officials, but also increasing the knowledge of school personnel. So this really should be considered a learning process, and it should be managed by some form of task force. In part 2, states review and revise their state policy. Under this part, states begin shifting policies to remove barriers to accessing health and safety supports and reducing school policies and procedures that can harm children with trauma. And then last, in part 3, states support school-driven initiatives to create supportive learning environments. And the assumption here is that there would be a funding mechanism to provide schools with the time and space to engage their community and to rethink their school environments. So we designed this tool to be highly actionable. So for each of the 3 parts, we provide examples from current state statutes and regulations for states to draw from. However, while the tool has a strong orientation towards statutes and legislative policy levers, the tool also provides a useful roadmap for state boards of education, for governor's offices, and for state education agencies. In fact, from state to state, it may be better or, in certain contexts, faster, appropriately faster, for certain parts of the framework, the task force under Part 1, for example, to be launched from a governor's office rather than established by a legislature. Throughout this conversation, there'll be multiple points of intersection between this tool, Child Trend release, and the choice points that you'll learn about in today's conversation that Leora will explain. And I'll be here the whole time to answer questions. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Now back to Leora.
All right, thanks, Kristen. So as we move into the agenda, so first of all, I just wanted to note that it is the universe coincidence of all times that both Kristen's guide and our guide went out literally, I think, the same week, if not the same day, and we had never spoken about, we were just completely in sync, and there's so much crossover. And Child Trends Guide, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit later in Choice Point 2, Child Trends Guide is a really rich resource for state leadership and for federal leadership. The guide that we put out is for, as we mentioned earlier, education and mental health leadership. It's much more a practice conversation. And so that's what brings us into this conversation. We're going to be exploring how we can leverage policies in both settings, and we all on the line today argue that even talking about educational mental health settings separately is actually part of the work. We've got to do some silo integration to improve the experience and outcomes for young people and the folks who serve them. So not just students, but the concentric circle of care of those who support students. And then we'll get to close with some questions of what remain and what resources can help us move the work. I do want to note that after every choice point, we will have time to learn from Rochelle and Kristen about what their experience has been in the field. And I want to really encourage, there's so much rich knowledge and funds of knowledge on the line. I really want to encourage folks that when you hear if something resonates, if you hear something that you agree with or argue with or have wonderings about, to please put those thoughts in the chat box. We will do our best, Rochelle and Kristen and myself will do our best to also provide resources that we mention. And so we want to make sure that this is as much of a rich resourcing as possible. So we're going to move forward, and I'm going to pass it to Rochelle to help us think about who's on the line.
Great. Thank you, Leora. So we'd love to hear a little bit. I know you've been all introducing yourselves on the chat, and thank you for doing that. We'd also like to know a little bit about your role and what brought you here to the webinar today. So Joanne, if you could please pull up our first poll, and if folks could take some time to respond. The first one is, I am a, and we have several options for you to respond to: a teacher or leader, a district administrator, a mental health leader, a mental health provider, state education system leader, a policymaker, or other. So if we didn't capture your category, if you could type that into the chat box, that would be great. And then it looks like you can be doing the second poll at the same time, so I will read that off. So the second one is, when you think of trauma-informed policy, do you feel comfortable with policy enough to lead a professional development on the subject? Are you still learning about what policies look like, what they mean, what they sound like, etc.? Or is this topic around policy completely new to you? It seems like maybe we missed some categories. So we've got quite a few people who have indicated that they fall into the other. And our next most popular category was mental health leaders. And in terms of where you are, in terms of thinking about trauma-informed policy, got a lot of learners on the line today. So I think that's great, and we look forward to sharing information with you today. I think we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne and Rochelle. As we move forward, let's set the stage in terms of what we're talking about when we even hear the word trauma-informed, when we're even talking about choice points, and honestly, the conversation about policy at all. I know that when I was a teacher and then teacher coach and then worked in districts and then at state levels, quite frankly, I got very little policy training. I got very little support to understand the implications or what it meant to co-create policy. It's really only been much later. And so policies usually the concentration, especially in the education spheres, are much more concentrated on practices and programs and the pedagogy, but policy is the other arm that really deserves a lot of attention, because particularly policy can both inform and also can reflect the undercurrent or the values that we're trying to espouse. And the word policy can really help us think about sustainability and capacity building, particularly because we get a lot of folks who are saying, well, trauma-informed, it's a phase, it's going to come in and out, and policies can actually help us really think about how to embed our values in infrastructure so that there is sustainable culture shift. So I want to talk about why we're even using the word trauma-informed. Some of you might really resonate with the word trauma-informed, some of you might not. We're actually going to be talking about that as we move into choice point 1 around names and definitions. And I want to just be clear that we're using the word trauma-informed or the phrase as a catch-all, mainly because one is that it stems out of the movement of trauma-informed care. The purpose, the real purpose, no matter what we call it, the real purpose of what we're intending to reference are policies that are centered on developing and sharing and promoting personalized learning environments where students and who serve them are at the center, that are informed by brain science, and are centered on positive school climate and relationships as the driver. So when I'm using the word trauma-informed, I intend to use that term, and in this conversation intend to use that term as really thinking about how we can use the latest and the most sometimes perplexing but really necessary learnings around what we're learning around brain, and I would also probably expand it, not just brain, but brain and integrated body science, and how that impacts school climate, the word relationship is really at the center. And so we're going to move forward. Again, I want to say that all of us could really, if we all, usually in our trainings, what I have folks do is have a card down, and then I have folks write what the definition of trauma-informed is, and then we flip it up and we look at the variety of what folks use when they talk about it. It's not just an academic term. It's also usually informed by our own relationship to the word trauma. And so I just wanted to center us on how we're defining it for the rest of the conversation. And also this term choice point. So we did not create the word choice point. Actually, Race Forward is an organization that does really important racial equity work. They've also used the word choice point. The idea is that when we are leaders, when we are sitting in a seat of decision making, that instead of just going to the behavior or the action of the decision, to take one step back and to go, what are all the options that sit in front of me? And then the costs and the benefits of each option. And in our world, we really think about who benefits and who's harmed after each decision point and each choice point. So there are decision-making opportunities, and there are small decisions, there are big decisions. And I just want to mention the kind of silent partner in the conversation around choice point is also implicit bias. The part of our work as leaders is to get really explicit about what choices we're making, for whom, by whom, and with whom. So speaking of choice points, today we've got 4 key policy choice points that we believe can really support the trauma-informed school policy conversation. The first, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about names and definitions. So what's the intended outcome of the trauma-informed work? And focusing on the intended outcome can really influence the way that we term what the thing is. And how do we choose language both of the policy and within the policy that reflects the mission and the vision of the work? The second choice point is in that really lovely yellow that you may not be able to see, is platforms and levers. And so in choice point 2, we invite you to kind of take a community organizing hat on and to think about what's the right policy entry point. So some of us, like I'm looking at who's on the line today, we've got folks who work in schools, with schools, at the state level, at the federal level, which is actually a really beautiful reflection of the importance of having multi-sector and multi-platform collaboration. And sometimes based on the context, we need to be really sharp and discerning about through which door will a policy have the most traction and have the most sustainability. The third point is your approach. So there's a lot going on. We have a lot going on in schools, in mental health. There's so much. We can talk about violence prevention, school climate, college and career readiness, and we each kind of enter this conversation with our own paradigm. Part of the approach conversation is to be really choiceful in thinking about if we should be adding policies, amending them, aligning them, dropping them. So that really speaks to dropping policies that re-traumatize, or even adding a new policy altogether. So we'll be discussing that in more depth. And then the last, which is honestly I think the hardest, is matching the process to product. So the choice as a leader is, as we engage in developing trauma-informed school policy, in the creating and developing verb, what are we doing to reflect the principles that we are espousing for other folks to experience? So we're going to be talking a little bit about that later on as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to take a breath, a lot of lead up, and we're going to go into choice point 1. I just want to be really clear that I could talk about choice point 1 for a very, very long time. Choice point 1 is all about names and definitions. So how do we talk about the work? The biggest word in this question, in this essential question that we're sitting with, is the intention. What's the intention of the work, and how do we choose language that reflects that intention? So for example, when we think about intention, we're actually going to do an understanding by design or backwards mapping. That's a shout out for some curriculum and instruction teachers in the room. And we're going to start with what are the outcomes, either student learning outcomes, district outcomes, state, federal, that we're hoping to see and envision. Then taking one step as a pause and thinking about what are the cultural and situational contexts that we're sitting with. So that can be about, like, what's the environment like right now? So it might mean that, well, there's been a big crisis, there's been a big safety breach, either because of an experience of violence, a school shooting, that can sometimes actually be a window for policy that we've been trying to work into practice to come alive because there's a heightened sense of urgency because of a cultural and situational context. There might also just be some shifts. So there are those of us, I often do trauma-informed school coaching, and there are a lot of veteran teachers in the room who will say to me, this is not new. We've been doing this for a long time in the small schools movement or in other contexts. And the piece that is new is the new learning around brain and body integrated science, but also that there is a reason that where we are now, February 2019, that there is a fluency and an elasticity to really thinking about our work and our role in understanding trauma and all that that means for young people in schools and for those who serve them. And then we can take even one further step back, which is the place that for us as leaders we have to live in. It's not the what, it's the why, our values and belief systems. So I want to give an example, a concrete example. So when we think about values and belief systems, some of the core questions that can really inform how we talk about trauma-informed policy are, for example, like, what does safety mean? Not just to you, but to your young people, to their family members. Are there different definitions of safety that folks live with so that when we talk about safe schools, we might be assuming that our definition is everyone's definition? So how do we actually take time to massage out what safety means, what discipline means, what a crisis means? All of those unearth our values and belief systems that sometimes are getting played out and we're seeing in inequitable data. So we have to take a leadership point to sit in some of those questions. Another question to consider is if your community or culture, so this is going back into kind of a cultural or situational context, does your community or culture respond more to prevention, intervention, or postvention? So again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of folks who really get moved to show up in reaction or response. There are a lot of other folks who will step up and step in to joining a trauma-informed school movement if it's from a prevention angle. And the other piece, we're going to talk about Sean Ginwright in a second, but Sean Ginwright, and I'll put his article, if you haven't read Healing Centered Schools yet, I'll put his article in the chat box when we get to leadership questions. But one of the pieces that his article talks about, so he is really inviting us to move from trauma-informed schools into healing-centered engagement. And one of the reasons that he came to that is when he was sitting with a group of young people and he used the word trauma. One of those young people said, well, I'm more than what happened to me. And so his whole point is, actually, I don't want, because of the cultural and situational context, particularly being in communities of color, been historically disenfranchised and historically pathologized, we're actually not okay to use the word trauma-informed because that marks us as the worst thing that's happened to us rather than the way in which we are navigating and making meaning of the experience. And so I just wanted to mention that because of even in this conversation around our values, belief systems, cultural and situational context, it really impacts the outcome, particularly because the word trauma can even be an empowering term, right? There are some folks, especially there are some schools that say, well, actually, we want to name it and center it because we want to make sure that it's known and explicit in our practice. Some folks that are not going to use that term because it might exacerbate, as I mentioned earlier, historic issues of inequity. I just want to say that it's really important that even in this conversation about names, I want us to think from a macro level about which communities we're using the word trauma-informed to describe and which communities don't need or don't get termed as trauma-informed, even though they completely replicate or represent the demographics that the original ACEs study studied. So even in our conversation when we use the word trauma-informed, it's really important that we as leaders are investigating our own bias in the names and definitions. So I'm going to bring up a slide that might bring up some tiny font fear, and I just want to invite folks to take a breath. This is all from the guide that's in your session handout. We're not going to go through it. We're not going to go through it one by one, but I just wanted to mention that even in the word trauma, there are variations of definitions. And for us, when we're designing policy, for us to take a moment to go, what definition of trauma are we using and why? And again, for whom, by whom. So I just want to point out, and I'm going to try and use my handy-dandy pointer, that in definition 1 that comes from the Center on Domestic Violence, they make in the definition of trauma, transphobia, homophobia, gender-based violence, and microaggressions, for example, center to their definition of trauma. We have SAMHSA's cornerstone definition of trauma in 2014 that is built up on a lot of different work that actually centers the individual and understands that the individual trauma is a result of events or series of events. And I just want to point out here too that explicitly named in SAMHSA's definition is mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being, which often for us as practitioners, we get straight to the practices and programs that speak potentially to mental, a little bit to emotional, but quite frequently not spiritual. So I wanted to just note that. And the last definition example is from the Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice out of Drexel University. And they use a definition that centers trauma as the experience that overwhelms people's ability to cope. And when we teach this definition, part of what always comes up with educators is, oh, what overwhelms someone's ability to cope? Well, it's relative, it's not standard, it's not necessarily clinical, but it can be really open in definition. So some of us are going to have, we all resonate with different definitions, and part of our work is to think about how we can have conversations as leaders and foster really difficult, tricky conversations that will impact the quality of the work. So again, another tiny font situation that I just wanted to parcel out, that even in the term trauma-informed, we have a variation of how to talk about this work. So across the country, we have educators and folks who are steeped in mental health and trauma and a variety of different ways to approach this conversation, and all of us are coming to different ways of understanding it. So some of us, I know we've got some folks on the line from Washington. You might know that out of Washington came with the term compassionate schools. There's also trauma responsive or trauma sensitive schools. I'm going to use my little clicker so you can see again. So I just talked about trauma responsive, and then compassionate schools, which actually centers self-care explicitly in the conversation and really focuses on teacher understanding and teacher work. Healing centers, so that's Jen Wright's work. I really encourage you to read Jen Wright's work, not just the article, but the book that he's put out before that. He is using the word healing-centered engagement. Again, even in the question of healing-centered engagement, invites us as practitioners to think about, whoa, like what would that require for schools to take on the work of healing, which is really different than treatment or intervention. Healing is an engaged, relational, and holistic understanding of what it means to repair and then move forward. And so I just wanted to note that in a lot of the workshops that we do, the learning, the conversations that I would kind of expand on is how do we as educators or as mental health leaders, how do we even define the word resilience, healing, compassion, and how do the differences in the way that we come to the work, how might they influence the way that we show up for the people that we serve? And the last one, I know we've got some folks on the line who actually are part of RISE, Resilience-Oriented Schools. What Kaiser has done, Kaiser Permanente, is Kaiser's actually squared and centered school employee wellness, not just the focus on student well-being, but also the focus on school employee wellness. So part of what we see here is even in these 4 different definitions, not to mention, by the way, that across the country there are folks that are using adverse childhood or adverse community experiences, toxic stress. In Tennessee, there's the Building Stronger Brains movement. There are many different names. Part of the choice point is not just throwing on a term because that is what is available or that's what we know, but really being thoughtful and intentional about who and how do we call this work, who might it benefit, who may not, and then with this policy name, what practices would have to stay the same and what practices would have to shift. And that's also the work for us as leaders, because with every policy comes the practice and the programs that ensue. 2 quick reminders. One is that you can embody trauma-informed principles without calling it trauma-informed. It's really important. Some of us get very caught up in the name. Some of it's important for funding and recognition and being part of communities and acknowledgement. But a lot of us are doing really hard work, specifically at schools. We may not term it trauma-informed, but if we break down the principles and the outcomes, particularly around voice, choice, transparency, communication, we know that there are a lot of folks who are lifting up those principles in different ways that don't necessarily call it trauma-informed. The last piece that I just wanted to note is that all of these definitions and more are in Appendix 1 in the guide, where it says TI Policy Guide in your handout. Okay, so I'm going to pass it to Rochelle, who's going to break down in her experience what this has felt like as she in Denver Public Schools was thinking about what to name the work. And I do want to note that that we actually have the sample resolution in your session handout. So you can refer to that while you're listening or just listen to Rochelle.
Thanks, Leora. And what you'll see on your screen right now are some of the leadership questions that are in the guide for this particular choice point around names and definitions. And so in my role as a local school board member, the question that I would always lead with is why? And Leora said that earlier. I think that asking ourselves, why do we need this for our students, helps to drive the outcomes that we were interested in seeing. And I could share essentially that we wanted a model that was strategic, that was culturally responsive, that was strength-based and preventative, that would meet the diverse needs of our students, our families, and our educators in the schools. And actually not just our educators, but everyone in our school system. We really imagine this as a cultural shift that would happen at every level of the district, from the school board all the way to our school leaders, our educators, and every adult that children interact with in school systems. And we knew we wanted to do this to help mitigate the impact of the trauma that trauma can have on the social, emotional, and academic growth of our students. What is really nice is that in Denver, there had been work on a Denver Plan 2020, which really outlined the core values that would drive all of our work and our decision making. And those core values are students first, integrity, equity, collaboration, accountability, and fun. And the thing that I enjoyed most about being on the board was seeing how these values really showed up in our practice and how they guided our decision making and created a culture that we knew we wanted to create in order to meet our goals. And so when I work with systems, coming to common ground around language is crucial. It's the first step that we always take, especially as you think about school systems where you've got students and families from diverse backgrounds. You have providers and educators who are coming from different systems. And so as Leora indicated, trauma in one system can have a very different definition than what the term trauma would mean in another system. And so coming to consensus on that was really important. I worked really closely with our Director of Student Services and Supports in the district for this resolution. And what was apparent to me was really that Denver had so many neat initiatives and some different policy pieces that were already in place. And what this resolution actually did was to provide and help provide a framework, really, because there were different pieces that were occurring and pulling things together to recognize the work that Denver had already been doing and where we could still go was what we wanted to achieve from putting forth this resolution. It also helped to provide a sense of urgency around the work as well. As Leora said, sometimes there are events that are occurring in the community or data that's been released recently that might highlight a certain trend that is happening with your students or educators. And that was a little bit of what was happening here. And so trauma-informed was a term that was already being used within our district. And so this resolution offered an opportunity to pull all that work together into one space to recognize where we were and where we wanted to go. And the last thing I'll say around this is really that as we made decisions as a school board, one of the recommendations that I always kept in my mind was a piece of advice from a Native colleague who said that when the elders talk about making decisions in this that impact kids and families, they always think about that as making decisions for the next 10 generations. And to me, that was just such an impactful statement to recognize that all these decisions that we make should be so intentional, knowing that these decisions are going to impact kids for many generations to come. So I will end with that and pass on to the next slide.
It's a great segue, Rochelle, because when we talk about choice point 2, platforms and levers, we really think about the word standardization and sustainability. So again, what are the doors through which we as educational and mental health leaders, when we are thinking about crafting, developing policy, which door or audience, stakeholder might we go to first? It's all about audience. Might we go to first, even in the creation, and then development, of course, review, and then passage in order to really make that cultural shift and change. So I wanted to mention that the real work around choice point 2 when we think about platforms and levers is that platforms and levers are really unique to your context and environment, right? So we've got some folks on the line that come from local control states, which really lift up the autonomy of individual schools and districts and have a degree of autonomous decision making. We also have Hawaii on the line, the only state in the country to have a single statewide school district, so it actually, coming from a large systems space, might be more effective for Hawaii. So all of it is about knowing what nest you're sitting in, the kind of layers of ecosystem to make this work happen. And I'm going to pass it to Kristen, who's going to give us an overview of what you were even talking about when we talk about policy levers, and then get into a little bit more around choice point 2.
Thanks, Leora. So earlier, Leora spoke about the different ways that we can define trauma-informed work and the outcomes we seek, and the implications for the communities and partners we engage. What I hope you'll take away from this slide is the fact that there are multiple points of entry to ensure that trauma-informed language, outcomes, practice, and values are reflected in policy. Policies are made by organizations and agencies to achieve aims and goals. In education, policies can be established at different levels: schools, districts, states, federal agencies. They can be built by different entities, individuals, schools, school districts, school boards, state education agencies, state boards of education, legislators, governors. They can come in different forms. They can be requirements, rights, limitations, resources, which means that different policies can be more or less useful to carry out particular ends. So oftentimes, the most powerful type of policy we contend with are regulations and statutes set at either the state or federal level. With statutes, you have the ability to impose very powerful requirements and mandates on schools and school districts, or sharply limit certain practices, or mobilize new resources to build new capacity or implement new practices. So these tend to be really powerful tools for setting priorities across the state. However, statutes and regulations can be slow-moving, and once established, they can end up looking very different on the ground than what it was intended to be when it was written on paper. And once on paper, they can sometimes be inflexible. You often don't have great tightness of fit between the needs of a particular community and the resources or restrictions provided for in regulation or statute. So great potential to generate change, but also a lot of room for error. Also at the state and federal levels, you have executive orders and administrative actions. These have the advantage of moving much more quickly than regulation and statute, and they are much easier to change. However, they're relatively limited in what they can accomplish compared to regulation and statutes. In general, you can't design an executive order or an administrative action that conflicts with current statute and regulations. But these can take the form of guidance documents to clarify current law or explain how schools and districts comply with current law. They can be letters to communicate current policies. They can be plans for implementing federal laws and programs. Think, the Every Student Succeeds Act or Medicaid plans. These are administrative actions. Now, shifting gears a bit, at the local level, you have board resolutions and policies. Here's where you get into policy creation that can be heavily responsive and tailored to the needs and values of a community. School boards use resolutions to memorialize its decisions, communicate a clear goal or commitment for a community, establish local policies and procedures, or clarify terminology from their governing documents. And these are enforceable in court. And then, of course, you always have school rules. And there you have possibly the greatest potential for tightness of fit between the needs of a community and what's written on paper. And you probably have the greatest opportunity to engage communities to build policy that reflects your values. However, your freedom to set policy at the school level is probably heavily circumscribed by all the layers of policy I described earlier. So I'm going to pass it to Leora to just walk through how these policies end up functioning, whether we take a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach, and the implications of both.
Yeah, or both, right? So part of what Kristen was mentioning or giving us an overview was both examples from top-down and bottom-up. Again, as I said in the intro, part of this is to think about from an organizing standpoint, what's really going to have the most traction. We know, like last year, for example, the House just passed a Resolution 443, which really codified the recognizing and encouraging trauma-informed care nationwide. But that's in last year, and that work had been going on local levels in a variety of what even local means for the last 20. trauma-informed care really stemmed from the domestic violence space in the mid-'80s and '90s. So we owe a lot to folks who came before us who we weren't necessarily interested, ready, or understood how to integrate into particularly education contexts until now. So I just wanted to mention that we've got a variety of ways to come about this. I really want to encourage folks in the chat box, if you've got examples of what you've done to move policy, either from state government, state mental health, ISDs, or what, for example, adopting like National School Board Association resolutions look like at the local level. So I really want to encourage folks. I know Kendall's doing it from ABC here in California. Awesome. And again, also what this could look like from the local level. And I'm going to pass it to Rochelle to bring us back to Denver so that you can talk about how you organize this from the local level.
Yeah, so what was exciting about the time that we were in was that there were some local advocacy efforts that were contributing to kind of that community-driven, the community readiness for this kind of a resolution and some policy changes. And some work was also happening at the state level as well. So in March of 2017, our state lawmakers were considering some legislation that would curb suspensions and expulsions in preschool through second grade. And simultaneously, our district was adopting policy that would put us on that cutting edge of discipline reform. So what ended up happening was that the legislation didn't pass at the state level, which I think goes to the importance of engagement and support at all levels. And what happened was there was resistance from a group that was representing rural school districts who really felt that the bill would take away one of their few tools for addressing behavioral problems in the classroom. But Denver went ahead with a commitment to eliminating the use of suspension and expulsion for our youngest learners and providing some restorative practices in social emotional learning and skill building opportunities to support the growth of the whole child. And so that was one piece that was happening, and that kind of led into this heightened support and awareness around the need for trauma-informed as well. So it was neat to be able to see it happening at both sides, both from the ground up and from the state. Leora, I'll go back to you now.
Thanks. So we're moving, thank you, Rochelle. And if this is feeling like really fast and a lot, yes. And again, I just want to reiterate, we're so happy to be in conversation and continue the conversation offline and in different settings. So we're moving into choice point 3, which is a super juicy choice point. There's so much to talk about. I just wanted to mention that, again, like I said earlier, we hear all the time that, oh God, trauma-informed is going to be a new fad. It's going to come and go. And part of this work is so that for us as leaders to figure out ways in which for this not to seem like another thing or a new thing or one more thing for folks to do, take on, learn, but instead how to really integrate it. So there are 5 different ways that we can approach the work. We can add on a commitment to trauma-informed care to existing policies. So for example, Kendall mentioned the California Youth Suicide Prevention Policy. So part of the work would be, well, let's comb through that policy and think about where trauma or the understanding of trauma and intersections in suicidal ideation or completion land. Can drop policies that are trauma uninformed. The word zero tolerance should pop up in everyone's head, throwback to 1990s, 2000s, because we were really not supporting young people to come to accountability with an understanding of discipline and the intersection of the brain, body, and behavior, and the needs behind all 3. We can amend policies, so they may not be able to drop because they're required by law, but we can amend them to become more trauma-informed. Adapt resolution, and then the last one is align. So we're going to do a double click into align to make sure we like alignment. I know it's like going to the chiropractor. So let's take trauma-informed school policy to the chiropractor, and we're going to look at a couple of them really distinctly, and again in the guide that there are a lot more examples. So one of the biggest ways right now in schools is to really think about aligning school expulsion disciplinary policy with a trauma-informed lens. So we would concentrate on safety and relationship and meaning-making as a part of discipline. Like I said earlier, one of those questions as a leader is to think about how are we supporting young people and the adults in the community to really be accountable for what they have done as an action, but also get the supports that are behind their behavior, that speak to their true need. I'm going to just go a little bit, I'm going to go to, that was really quick, to social and emotional health school policy or wellness policy. So an example here is to align the work around really making sure that what we provide for the people who serve our young people also experience it. So one of the biggest issues that I often see in schools is the dissonance. We ask teachers and mental health providers to provide services in a way that's trauma-informed when they themselves are not receiving supports that are trauma-informed. And so we want to create a whole ecosystem of that. For example, there's a school in Los Angeles that some of us on the line have had the pleasure of working with who, before they even enacted or brought in restorative circles to their students, they actually had a full semester of just doing restorative practices during faculty meetings and PD themselves for adults as a way to experience it, and then they kept that going. I want to note that there are many ways that we can really think about social and emotional health and policy or wellness policies in a different way and align those. The last piece that we're going to talk about is this trauma response readiness and recovery. So this is a huge area that we can align the work around trauma-informed. Recovery should be the bingo, 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 huge highlighted, bolded word in crisis response. We're super good as a country in doing crisis response. We're pretty okay, maybe at doing readiness, and we're pretty in need of a lot of support doing recovery. And so when we do work in schools or school districts, the conversation is, okay, if you have a crisis response or management plan, what's the recovery and the healing plan that goes along with it? What's the repair? How might that be peer-led? How might that be student-led or family-driven? We're seeing that a lot right now in some of the school shooting drills, right? We've got we've got practices that are being termed crisis readiness that are really untrauma informed. I could say a lot more about this, so please ping me if you want to have further conversations here. So I just wanted to note, Kristen, I think you were going to mention a couple of pieces about Choice Point 3, but I'm actually hoping that we can move into Choice Point 4 because we really want to get to this matching process to product. But one of the pieces about Choice Point 3 to really sit with is around strategy and which partners are a part of the strategy, which partners maybe should not be part of the strategy at that point in the longevity of your trauma-informed development. So specifically with this section, I'm really going to refer you to the guide that has a lot of practice and leadership sessions suggestions so that we can really think about how to engage our stakeholders in figuring out the right avenue for the right approach for trauma-informed policy. Okay, friends, this is my favorite, and it is the stickiest, most wobbliest, hardest one, which is matching process to product. So how do we mirror a trauma-informed approach in the development of a policy and in the implementation? So some of us might be familiar with the SAMHSA 6 trauma-informed principles: safety, transparency, and trustworthiness, choice and collaboration, peer support, mutuality and empowerment, and attunement to cultural, historical, and gender issues. We can definitely workshop those principles to make them more reflective of our value, but they're a really wonderful launch point. And I just wanted to note that part of, again, where we see some of the most blockage from a policy actually turning into equitable action, equitable practice and program, is when there's an experience of dissonance. So I want to bring up an example of what this can look like when we embody the principles it espouses. So as we're developing policy, how might we sit in cross-sector collaboration? So Rochelle mentioned earlier that you're going to have, you need to build consensus. There are folks on the line who are community-based organizations, mental health practitioners. There are folks who are trained in education. There's a whole gamut of different paradigms. It's so important that when we think about developing a policy to have multiple voices and sectors in the room. So one is cross-sector collaboration. That can also look like, by the way, districts really getting your college and career folks, your academic, curricular, and instruction, and your student support all in the same space, because the work of trauma-informed doesn't just fit in the emotional or mental health division, right? It's a universal division. The other piece is around transparent communication. So we are really good at doing things behind closed doors, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. So what does it look like to be transparent and be choiceful as a leader in thinking about how to communicate where this work, how this work is being developed, where it's being developed, by whom, and what the purpose and outcome is? And a lot of that can come out in Choice Point 1 when we're thinking about the names and definitions. But one of the last pieces is centering equity and justice. So even in the development of a policy, how do we investigate and interrupt and challenge power dynamics? How do we really interrogate who's holding on to power over instead of power with, as some of our colleagues often say? And that can really look into us thinking about, okay, well, if we're going to tell students that they're allowed to develop policy, what do we really mean when we say allow, and what do we really mean if they come up with a policy that we as adults are not comfortable with? And how do we start to have those transparent conversations about power dynamics, again, centering equity and justice? And so I'm going to turn to Rochelle for Rochelle to give some examples about what this looks like in your practice as I turn to some leadership questions that can help us think about how to embody the principles that we're espousing to put into policy.
Thanks, Leora. And so what I was excited about for this phase of the work was really after the resolution was passed, the district was charged with coming up with their action plan around it. And in terms of an update of things that have happened since then, it's great to report that there have been cross-system collaboration efforts that have taken place. There's a development of a stakeholder group that represents many of the different systems that are engaged in the work, and really an effort to now go into completing reviews of policies, so to do some of that work that was mentioned in Choice Point 3. And the other piece that I think is important is that this work is happening at all different levels. And so there's district-wide training and coaching and support that is happening to school communities to help increase their awareness of the impact of trauma in academic and behavioral performances. I think what is really next and kind of where we need to focus now as a district is really around our data and measurement. I think that given the field of trauma-informed and knowing what we know about brain science, I think that as we think about policies that are being implemented in different school districts and the procedures that are being changed, like how do we know what we know is successful? And I think this is where many school districts struggle around thinking about what should be the metrics of success in this work. So that's kind of what I see moving forward in this work, and it's exciting to see that the sense of urgency around doing this work and the importance of it and the potential impacts that our policy work can have are amazing. So I'm encouraged to see the amount of interest in this webinar, and as Leora said, just eager to continue conversations with folks as you start this journey. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to just stop there and pass it over to Leora.
It's okay. Yeah, this is like how three people who are so passionate about this conversation. Again, like the last point I would just want to say with Choice Point 4 is how can we as leaders ensure that the folks who are creating policy feel grounded, supported, and regulated to create policy so that young people get the opportunity to ground and learn the complex experience of regulation. So it's that ripple and concentric circle of care that we're really aiming for. Speaking of regulation, I just took an exhale. We're going to move to our closing. I do want to invite folks to put in the chat box any questions that you're sitting with. So what are the biggest choice points related to trauma-informed policy that after our conversation you're sitting with? What decision-making points are you challenged with? What idea is like making you super excited out there in Washington, Connecticut, Hawaii, Nevada, wherever you are? What idea do you want to like absolutely take on the ground and just like get going right now at 3:59 p.m. wherever you are? I'm going to just move forward as folks are putting their thoughts into the chat box. We've got a lot of next steps. Kristen, did you want to say anything about the guide that you released and any next steps that come with it, just really briefly?
Sure. We released a document that provides an overview of state school health policies in all 50 states. In addition to the trauma-informed policy framework that we released, we will be doing deep dives in 3 states, including Washington, Tennessee, and Missouri, just to figure out, where we can provide some policy support and assistance. And one of our major next steps is to also do, in addition to the 50-state policy analysis, to do a local level policy analysis in 450 school districts across 20 states, and that'll be released this spring.
Okay, yes. We'll definitely send that out to you very quickly in the last couple minutes together. At the bottom of your screen, if you're in California or want to come to the California School-Based Health Alliance Pre-Conference Institute on, it actually should say May 9th. There's a link. I will be with my colleague Lisa Eisenberg leading an actual real experience of this work. So definitely come to the conference. You can also, of course, always request us to come and lead this conversation wherever you are. I do want to mention this is the first of our school mental health 2019 webinar series, so you can join me on March 21st as I talk all things mental health and student learning outcomes. How do we sit in the worlds of education and mental health and have the same conversation? We've got really, really robust lineup coming up, and I really hope that you join us for the next couple webinars. And the last is that I just want to, as we close, you're going to have a few questions that appear on your screen as you log out. We really, really encourage you to take them because that's how it supports the work, this work to keep on going. And I do want to say that you've got the resources in your session handout. You should have gotten an email with everything. If you haven't, you can email Joanne or email us. Our contact information I'm going to leave up. And we are just so incredibly, incredibly, incredibly thrilled for the attendance. I want to thank Rochelle and Kristen so much for joining this conversation. And let me know or us know if you have any questions. Again, email. I'll put my email in the chat box as well. And I wish everyone a really, really empowered afternoon.